Welcome to our Forest in a Changing Climate Green Drinks. Here's my document. My name is Ginevra. I'm the program director at Sustainable Woodstock. We are a nonprofit. We were founded in 2009, and we're an environmental action and education organization that builds on Woodstock's legacy as birthplace of the modern conservation movement. Our vision promotes vibrant, inclusive, thriving communities where we live sustainably now and in the future. You've come to one of our monthly green drinks. These are social events to connect people and educate people who have similar interests in the environment. We invite nonprofits, businesses, individuals, organizations to make short presentations that highlight sustainability and green initiatives in our area and extending beyond just the Upper Valley in Vermont sometimes. We've been hosting these events virtually for quite a while and have gotten a great response and attendees. And I do want to call out that our June and July green drinks will be in person due to the nature of the topic. So I'll just quickly give a shout out to next month's green drinks, which will be on June 29th, titled No Till, Gardening Without Disturbance. As we learn about the significance of soil life, we find out that disturbing soil is no longer recommended, but how do we transition away from tillage? And we'll be joined by Kat Buxton to demonstrate some ways to do that. That'll be in Woodstock at our community garden. And I'll send out the registration info after this event. It's kind of exciting to be doing some things in person and outdoors. So before we get started, I'm just going to run through how this is going to operate. We are recording, double check. Yes, we are. You're currently muted. So if you have questions during or after Ali's talk, please do put them in the chat box on Zoom. And then Michael, our executive director, and myself will pose those questions to Ali afterwards. So if you're not familiar with Zoom, you can hit the chat bubble and the chat will open. If you don't see a chat bubble, you can hit the ... icon and you should be able to open a chat function that will allow you to type a question or comment. So we'll pose those questions to Ali after she's done speaking, and I'll follow up with any info, links, contact info, whatever it is that Ali wants me to send. And I think that's pretty much it. Before I introduce Ali, I would like to just give a brief thank you to Tim Stout of Northam Forest Carbon for making the connection to Ali and helping to make this event happen. We're really grateful to him and his work. So I'm going to go ahead and read your bio here, Ali, so folks know you. Ali Kosiba is a forest ecophysiologist and extension assistant professor of forestry at the University of Vermont. As the extension forester, she creates resources and conducts applied research to help landowners, foresters, and decision makers to better understand the impacts of climate change and other stressors on Vermont's forest and management techniques to improve forest resilience. Ali serves as a regional educator on forest carbon science and management and is the state lead on the Vermont Forest Carbon Inventory. She also works on various forest health topics like planning and management for at-risk tree species, land planning for maintaining critical forest services, and forest monitoring. So we're very excited to have you back. It's been quite a while, Ali, and excited to hear what's changed and in the forest carbon world. So take it away.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me. And thanks everyone for coming out on this beautiful evening. So I'm going to be talking about Vermont's forest in a changing climate and what you can do if you're a landowner or encourage other landowners or inform policy. I guess if you're not a landowner, there's lots of things we all can do to steward our woods in the future. And I did talk to this group. Yeah, I don't exactly remember when that was, but on forest carbon. And there's lots of interactions between what I'm going to talk about today and forest carbon. All right. So our climate is changing here in Vermont. We know this from long-term records that we have. This is showing Burlington weather station, but it's sort of indicative of Vermont climate change. So we have on the left annual average temperature that has increased about 3 degrees since we've have these records, which is the late 1800s, and then precipitation has increased about 9 inches, which is a pretty significant percentage increase. I think that's about 25% increase in that time. So it's warmer and we're getting more rain. What has this resulted in for our forests? Well, we're seeing a longer growing season. And many of you have probably recognized that, especially this year. But if you're a gardener, you probably are aware of this too. We have about 3 weeks longer growing season since the late 1800s. You can see that in this map. And this has a number of impacts. It's actually, all things aside, is good for trees. Our climate is what we call temperature limited, means our trees, our plants are really limited by the length of the growing season, the amount of they can grow each year, the amount of time they have to photosynthesize and make sugars and starches to store, have time to flower. All those processes are really limited by temperature and how long that growing season is. So that extends, they have more time to grow. And we're actually seeing that in tree ring records, which is something that I do. I collect tree rings from trees, and we can see that some species in some locations are actually growing really well with climate change. The key to this is that water has to be available, and water is key to all these processes, including growth and photosynthesis. This also means that trees can put away extra reserves. They might have extra energy for things like flowering or defense chemicals. Of course, these longer growing seasons don't just impact plants and trees, it also impacts all the other life in our forests, including, notably our insects and insect pests of trees. So defoliators and wood borers and all those other insects that can cause decline and even mortality in our trees. So we are seeing that certain insects might have more generations in a year. So maybe they have 1 or 2 generations in a summer. With that 2 weeks extra growing season, they might be able to squeak in a 3rd generation, or they just have more time, they get bigger. So that means they eat more, they consume more leaf matter or whatever plant matter they are consuming. So there is some research showing that caterpillars are just bigger with this longer growing season. We're also seeing or kind of monitoring these changes for what we call phenological mismatches. So phenology is just a timing of natural events. So that's, when certain plants flower or when certain birds migrate back to Vermont, that's all phenology. What we know is that we could have different species sort of respond to climate change differently. They might not respond at the same rate. And so example of a phenological mismatch, this photo is showing American basswood, which is one of our few insect pollinated trees. A lot of our trees are just wind pollinated, so their pollen just gets transported by the wind to a female flower, and that's how they're pollinated. But some of our trees, like American basswood, rely on insects. So there could be a situation if these flowers emerge at a different time from their insect pollinators, they might not be able to be pollinated. So that's just one example of a phenological mismatch, but there's a lot of other examples, including in the soil, that folks are monitoring and doing research about. We're also worried about things like spring frost damage, which sounds like reports. We had some last night. I was really worried actually about a lot of our tree species last night because they leafed out very early. We have pretty much full canopy for some of our species. Some of our species are leaf out at different times. Notably, ash is it is late to leaf out, so that hasn't fully leafed out. But I haven't seen a lot of damage this morning and today in our tree species, but I actually did see some damage in knotweed, which was actually kind of beneficial as that's an invasive plant. But what we see is when we have this early growing season, really warm springs, we still can get these cold temperatures in May. So mid-May is kind of the time when we can get these. And these are actually images here I'm showing of sugar maple, which is a species that leaves out. It's one of the earliest to leaf out of all our native tree species. And the leaves, when they're in this stage, are very sensitive to cold. And so this is actually 3 different years frost damage that I captured. And you can see in this top image, the leaves kind of get scorched around the edges, and so they get misshapen. They still can function, or sometimes they get so damaged that they're completely dead. The trees will reflush a new set of leaves. It's usually not that big of a deal for, a mature established tree. They have extra reserves to do this, but the concern would be if it happened multiple years, and to the same trees, that could be a pretty significant stress. Oops. The other thing we're seeing, and many of you probably are seeing this too, is milder winters. I think this was a good example. This winter, we did have that cold snap of -20, -25 in places, but it was pretty short-lived. So we're seeing that on average, our winter temperatures are changing much faster than the rest of the seasons. In fact, 2.5 times faster than our annual temperature. So it's a season that's changing the most. And you can see that in this map. The Northeast region and so the lake states have experienced, about 4 degrees increase in our winter temperatures. Milder winters mean a few things for our trees. One way to look at this is by plant hardiness zones. Again, if you're a gardener, if you have plants around your house that you have introduced and planted, you might be aware of this, but plant hardiness zones really just describe the minimum winter temperature expected at that location. And that's really a threshold for many plants. If they can't withstand that minimum winter temperature, they might have bud damage or stem damage or just completely die. And so currently most of our state is, zone 4, zone 5. So that's minimum winter temperature of -30, maybe -20. The projection for the end of the century, and granted, this is a model, this is far in advance, is for those plant hardiness zones to change pretty dramatically so that, most of our state would be 6, 7, or 8 zone. And so for context, that is plants like southern magnolia or pecan that we could technically plant here and they would survive if those are the zones that we have in the future. So that's a significant change in our cold winters. We also can see some benefit to some of our trees, our native trees here, with less cold winters. We do have a number of species here in Vermont that are marginally cold hardy. So that means that most of their range extends down in the southern United States. An example of that is on the left is American chestnut. American chestnut, maybe many of you know, was really a dominant, amazing tree on the eastern forest, and it was decimated by introduced chestnut blight. Partially decimated too by people cut it down, thinking that all of them would be lost. So we don't know. There might have been some natural resistance in the species. We don't have a lot of examples. There are sprouts that pop up in Vermont. We don't have many mature trees except for those have been planted, but they are susceptible to cold damage. This is the range of the historic range of American chestnut, and it really extended in the Champlain Valley and the Connecticut River Valley. So it's sort of our warmer pockets in our state. And it's limited by the cold winters. And so one projection is that we might see chestnut be able to survive in places that it historically couldn't. And even some of our other species that we think of being very cold hardy. This is a photo of red spruce, a species that I've studied a lot. It is actually a species that grows well into Appalachia south of us, and it does suffer from cold damage. It was a relationship with acid rain causing this damage, but it was really this cold damage that happened over the winter. We call it winter injury. And so, there are some benefits from milder winters, and we could see less winter injury on some of these plants. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, with the longer growing season, these changes affect all aspects of our forests, and insects are another part of this that might see some changes from milder winters. One example of this is I'm showing here is hemlock woolly adelgid. That's a hemlock tree. This is what the adelgid looks like. That's actually sort of what's called an ovisac. So it's a covering over these little insects. It's very small, but it causes incredible damage to hemlock trees. And has done that down in Virginia, North Carolina, and other places in the Central Appalachians, where it's been established for quite a long time, much longer than here. In Vermont, it's limited to southern part of their state because the insect is killed by minimum lethal temperatures in the winter, about like -25. The insects are just killed. And so it's really been restricted to that part of our state, but we project that, as our winters get warmer, we might see this insect sort of march up and expand into other parts of the state. What we're also seeing is that we're experiencing more rain in the winter, more rain on snow, a shorter duration and less snowpack. So maybe places that used to historically have snow or not seeing snow, or even places that still have snow, it's not coming, and it's a permanent snowpack isn't being established until maybe January, and then it's melting out really early. And so this has a number of consequences in our forests. One is that snow acts as an insulative blanket, so it really protects roots. It protects shrubs and smaller plants in the bottoms of trees and their root systems from wind damage and really cold temperatures in the winter. So a species like sugar maple in particular has very shallow roots. Actually, a lot of trees, they might have roots that go deep for stabilization, but a lot of their what we call feeder roots, so these are the roots that access nutrients, access water, are very small, and they really only extend down maybe a foot. And so this, you can actually see in this photo, these are all little feeder roots of sugar maple. And so when we don't have snowpack, those roots can actually be damaged from the cold, so they can suffer from winter injury, or we have more freeze thaw events in the soil, and that actually physically breaks up the soil. It can break up, disrupt the roots, break up things like mycorrhizal fungi that are in the soil, and have a number of other processes disrupted. So we do know that snowpack is really important. We're also seeing, because of this sort of milder winter, earlier spring snow melt. And so the peak flows that we're experiencing in our streams that are from snow melt in the spring are happening earlier. And so that's just a phenomenon that's occurring and could have other impacts to, when trees leafing out and they need water, and flood events and all sorts of different cascading effects. We are seeing hotter summers, and in Vermont, we don't have super hot summers. One metric that's used is this indice of over 86 degrees. You can see we really don't have that many days that are over 86 degrees in a year. If you're down in the Champlain Valley, Connecticut River Valley, you might have, 2 weeks of those temperatures, but certainly up in the mountains, about a week or fewer days. But the projection is that it's going to increase, by the end of the century. And one of the things that we're worried about is not just necessarily the hotter summer, the hotter temperature, because we have so few of them. Those aren't lethal temperatures for plants, but it's the interaction between warmer air temperatures and water. So warmer air can hold more water, sort of a physical nature of the relationship between temperature and water vapor. And so what we see when we have higher temperatures is that there's more evaporation from water. So that can be from surfaces of leaves, that can be from soil, really anything from water bodies will have more evaporation. And so this can cause soil drying, drought stress, and sort of all those other impacts. And it's really hard for us to project because there's a lot of variability in soil type, depth of soil, how the water holding capacity of soil. And so we are seeing some increases. You can see in this map, this is drought monitor that's produced to show intensity of drought. We are seeing in some places that there have been droughts. We had some in Vermont last summer. This is, most of our mature trees can withstand this. They hold water in their trunks and their roots, and they can tap into some deep resources of water. We are concerned if we see droughts that occur over multiple summers, so multiple years in a row, but also even a short-lived drought can have an effect on our seedlings. So showing here sugar maple, right? The sugar maple seedling, the roots might only extend into the soil 6 inches or so, and so those a drought could really impact that whole cohort of seedlings for that year. And so this idea of cold-loving and warm-loving species is one we can use to think about how we move forward and what species might be more favored in a changing climate. And so in Vermont, we are lucky. We have a lot of different tree species, and we have species that what we call our northern species, our cold-loving species. The ranges of these species up here on the top, they extend well north of us, up into Canada, right? So this is balsam fir, yellow birch, northern white cedar, sugar maple, and white spruce. And there's others. That's just an example of some of them. And they can exist in very cold climates. They sort of like cold temperatures. And like I said, they exist well up into Quebec and other parts of Canada and northern Maine. We also have a suite of species we call southern species or warm-loving species. And these are species whose ranges extend well south of us. So these are all of our oaks, showing here red oak, but we have lots of different species of oak. All of them have ranges to extend south of us. Our pines, so red pine and eastern white pine, our hickories, shagbark hickory, showing here bitternut hickory. This is white oak, and then red cedar. And so that's just showing a few of them. We have other species, but those are sort of the species we think in a warming climate will do better, be less stressed, be more competitively advantaged. And so we're projecting that these southern species are ones we're going to see expanding in habitat, and these northern species, they're not going to all be lost anytime soon, but that they're going to be more stressed. They might be less competitive in a forest system. And just because they sort of rely on those cold conditions, maybe the deep snowpack, and that's what they're adapted to. As we think about more precipitation, the real big risk here is increase of foliar diseases. So this is when the foliage just remains wet more longer periods. And then you couple that with warmer temperatures, and we can see things like this is showing anthracnose, which is a foliar disease that affects actually a lot of different species. And then on the right, I'm showing white pine needle disease, which we think is, I say we, but I'm not one who researches this, but the scientific community thinks this is based on native fungi, and anthracnose is also native. So it doesn't necessarily mean that that invasive fungi will be the only species to benefit from changing climate. Some of our native fungi too, but just the conditions are changing as we see sometimes warmer and wetter spring conditions. We're seeing this white pine needle disease become more frequent and extensive. We're also seeing more heavy rainfall events. So this graph is showing the number of days with heavy precipitation over 1 inch of rain. And you can see that there is an increase over time since the early 1900s. And what this can do in our forests, heavy rainfall events can erode our soil, could wash away the leaf litter and expose those fine roots that I mentioned when talking about snowpack. This can actually deplete soil nutrients when rainfall events are very heavy. And of course, we're worried about the effects on water quality too when this happens. We may see more disturbance events too. This is really hard for us to model and project into the future because we don't have really good data sets on wind events or ice storm events. But we think just with the changing climate, we will see more wind, maybe more hurricanes, more things like ice storms where we have not quite cold enough temperatures to cause snow events, or maybe we see really heavy snow that comes and it's wet. And causes, this isn't really a problem, heavy wet snow for mature trees. It might break some branches, usually not. It's usually a problem for these really young saplings that sort of get bent over. But certainly ice storms can cause branch breakage and topple trees. And all of these events, they cause natural disturbances in our forests. And so they can promote change, that can create spaces for new seedlings and saplings to grow up and promote adaptation in our forests. What we're really concerned about with these events is infrastructure, houses, power lines, roads, and things like that that could be affected, especially with catastrophic events. So we have a lot of things going on in our forests. We have longer growing season that can be a benefit. I didn't mention CO2, but CO2 is one of the greenhouse gases, dominant greenhouse gases, that is contributing to climate change. It is what trees and plants use as their source of to make sugars and starches. They use the sun's energy in photosynthesis, and they use CO2. So we are seeing with more CO2, plants are actually more efficient and they can grow more. But then we have the suite of other stressors, other changes that are very positive, that will cause stress to certain species, maybe certain ages of trees over others. And we don't really know how all these changes will interact. And trees, are unique, unlike wildlife. Wild animals, they can't get up and move to a more favorable location. So there's sort of three options. They don't survive, right? They perish from these changes, or they can adapt to these changes. And many of our species are very adaptable, or they can also, along with the adaptation, they can also relocate to new locations through regeneration. So that involves flowering, creating seed, and having that seed find a place that's favorable, space to grow and grow up. And this has happened in the past. It's, geologic time, not that long ago, that our region was covered in ice and we didn't have forests, and forests came back. They came back from where they were in what we call refugia, where many of our species existed down in the Appalachians, and they slowly migrated back up. So about 11,000 years ago, we didn't quite have forests. We had, this kind of taiga, so a sparse conifer forest. But when we look at the changes in our temperature, so this is showing changes in temperature over time before present. So we had this very rapid change. We had the melting, this dotted red line, and I put that into the graph. So that's when the ice sheet melted here in New England, and we had started to have plants back in our area. And you can see we were on this sort of downward trend again. The climate was cooling, but what's really concerning is the rate of change that we're seeing recently. So this really rapid increase in the temperature is not like anything else these species have experienced in the past, right? The rates of change were much more gradual. And then we also have, the situation in our neck of the woods in New England and in the Northeast. We've had a lot of human impacts to our forests. And so it wasn't that long ago, early 1900s, you can see in this graph that Vermont, which is in this red line, had down to about 35% forested. A lot of our forests had been completely cleared for agriculture, some for development, and those areas have still remained that way. But there was farm abandonment when sheep farming and other farming wasn't profitable. People moved out west, farms are abandoned, and we've had this incredible resilience of our forests and regrown. And now we're about 75% forested. So it is an incredible testament for the ability of trees to respond to these changes and create forests again. But we have to remember that these forests are very young, and they are still developing over time from these changes. And even places that were not cleared for agriculture were often harvested in unsustainable ways. We didn't know a lot about ecology and have good forestry practices. People went in, they harvested the best trees out of the forest they could. And so that left a lot of legacies in our woods, where what we call high grading, so taking the biggest and best trees, or maybe taking only one species. And we see in our woods lots of evidence of that. So we have things like altered species composition in our stands. Often we have fewer species represented in our forest than would have occurred before these changes happen. So we even have situations like this left photo, all white pine. It's a very common occurrence in Vermont, old field white pine. White pine's great at growing on old abandoned agricultural land. These trees are all the same age, very closely spaced together. And I look at this and I see a very unhealthy forest because they don't have a lot of foliage, they look unhealthy, and there's probably not a lot going on in the understory as far as regeneration, species diversity. And this is a forest that is, still in development. So we have simplified physical structure because of that. We don't have the diversity in canopy layers within a forest or across a forest. We have reduced age class diversity in our stands. And we see things like a degraded stand condition sometimes. So there's effects of past logging, example here in this lower photo, or old logging roads that were left in the forest. We have things that happen like soil erosion because of land clearing. When you took off all the trees, there was a lot of erosion, compaction. There might have even been tilling if animals were grazed or if it was used for agriculture. There was significant impacts to the soil, and that created less varied forest floor topography. One thing we know in our forest, we have less dead wood, so less down logs on the forest floor, less standing dead trees than would have otherwise occur. And that's just because, again, our forests are really young and they haven't had the ability to develop over time. That involves trees dying and other trees taking their place, and so that natural progression. We also have a lot of non-native plants and certainly insects and diseases. This middle photo is showing, unfortunately, a common occurrence in our floodplain forest. This is goutweed in this forest, and that really does inhibit new regeneration of seedlings and saplings. They just can't get established in that competitive location. And what we call landscape homogenization, that across Vermont, we have more similarity in our forests just because they are in a similar age class than we would have had forests developed and changed, and there've been disturbances and all sorts of varied histories over centuries. So we sort of have this condition. We have legacies of past land use, all these other stressors that forests face, and then now climate change. And it set us up, that we have these forests that could be more resilient than they are, and they are sort of vulnerable to a lot of these stressors and changes. Also, I'd be remiss not to mention the importance of carbon that our forests provide. So our forests are here in Vermont are a carbon sink. They take in about half of our state's emissions. We're very fortunate to have this, but this ability for our forests to take in and store carbon is dependent on so many factors of the forest, but critically forest health, the occurrence of disturbances, stressors, forest loss, and climate change itself can inhibit this ability of our forest to provide this mitigation impact for us. And so I do want to say that there are things we can do. So if you are a landowner, no landowners have the ability to inform maybe your town forest management or inform policy, right? Speak up. We do have ways we can enhance resilience to climate change. So I am going to talk about the things we can do if we have the opportunity to do so. So we know from research that forests with more species, so a bigger diversity of species, and trees of multiple different sizes, ages, conditions, including dead wood, so dead standing, dead logs on the ground, regular gaps in the canopy. So we just want non-uniformity, right? So a forest that is less uniform is more resilient to climate change and other stressors. When it experiences those stressors, those disturbances, not all species, not all trees of the same trees of different ages, they don't respond the same. So if we have something like a windstorm, insect outbreak, having a diversity of species and ages in the forest, different conditions will mean that there is a forest in the future. And so we have this growing body of work and folks that are promoting this of what we call climate adaptive management. And really, this is the idea that we're incorporating climate change into our forest decisions, forest management decisions. And the goals really are to reduce the forest vulnerabilities and to advance resilience. And so this can include, active management you do. This also can include conservation, restoration of forests to improve their health and condition. So vulnerability is the degree to which a forest is susceptible and unable to recover from climate change. We know that certain forest conditions and disturbances can make a forest more or less vulnerable to climate change impacts. So this is really one of those ideas we need to really assess vulnerabilities on a site-by-site basis. There's no one rule of how our forests are vulnerable. They're all very different because of their species composition, their ages, their land use history, their current management, their site conditions, etc. And resilience is what we're striving for. It's the ability of a forest to adapt, to recover, and adapt following disturbance or change. So climate adaptive forest management sort of follows this, cycle, but really it's this identifying vulnerabilities that are specific to the forest, and then using strategies to reduce vulnerabilities if they exist, increase resilience, and facilitate adaptation to change. And then really important is monitoring, planning for the unexpected. And so that sort of cycles back to the identifying vulnerabilities. And so this goal, the goal here is to keep the forest as forest. It might change, the species mix changes, the ages change, sort of what the forest looks like is constantly changing in forest. We look out in forests and we think they're static. They're constantly moving just at a rate we can't see. And so part of this is helping and facilitating the forest to move in a direction that is more resilient and healthier. And so what we can do with some of these practices is we can do things like create complexity. So these photos are showing that when we have sort of this non-uniformity of our forest, compare those to the photo I showed of that old field white pine, we can increase species diversity. We can enhance ecological features and habitat of wildlife. We are also in a biodiversity crisis along with climate crisis, and that's because of losing critical habitat and land degradation. And so we can do a lot to improve those. I was just at a talk today from Alyssa Bennett, who works for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife, about using management to improve roosting habitat of endangered bats. That was really cool about how those could be paired together. We can also do things like designate reserves. So these are areas that we want to protect and leave, and that can be within active management. It can be separate, and we can do things like designate legacy trees that are to live out their full life cycle and provide a source of seed. We can also sustainably harvest resources with this. So this allows us to provide, a local source of products instead of, getting our products from elsewhere, support our local economy, support our neighbors. And so there's a lot of benefits here of doing this in a sustainable, ecological way. In the carbon world, we can actually move carbon around to different pools. So we have different pools of carbon in our forest. We can actually flux carbon into sort of the deadwood pool, the soil pool, etc., and actually get what I call resilient forest carbon. So if we have a resilient forest, that carbon can be stored and sequestered in the future. That photo I showed of old field white pine, one species, not resilient carbon. We get a one windstorm, we get one disturbance, that carbon could be lost. And that forest might not be a forest if there isn't regeneration underneath to take over. So I've developed these 12 steps to climate resilience, and if I'll show the link at the end of the presentation, and also I'll send the link, and you can download a flyer. I also have these like sort of cute little cards. They're about this big. I should have grabbed one to show you, but these little pocket cards you can take out in the woods, and I'm happy to mail those to you. Or if you come to one of my events, I gave a bunch to Tim, so he has a lot of them if you reach out to Tim Stout. And so this is the idea that if you're a landowner, these are just some ideas you can take and choose the ones that fit best for you of things you can do to include climate change in your forest planning. And so really the first one is getting to know your land. This is really critical and fun, especially if you're a new lander, but even if you've owned your land for a while, because we know that climate change will affect each forest land differently. And so getting to know the land and the conditions that land is in is really critical to think about the next step. And, one way to do this isn't the only way is to make a map. And if you have a forest management plan, there already be a map in there, but you could add different things to it. And so it's just thinking about water resources. Where are they? Where are your roads and trails? Are there issues with those roads and trails? Different forest types or species, different age classes of forests, or certainly things like invasive plants or areas where you see intensive deer browse, which is a problem in our forests. Whether you want to do active management, passive management, talking to a forester is really critical. These are folks that have education and continuing education in these topics, and they can help you sort of think through and articulate your goals. And certainly if you're enrolled in the current use program in our state, you need to work with a licensed forester. And so just could be a good thing to walk through your woods, talk about your goals and that you want to manage for climate resilience and adaptation. And if you ever need someone to talk to, we do have a great resource in our state with our FPR county foresters. Regardless of your parcel size, they will come out and talk to you and look at your woods. So that's a great resource that landowners should take advantage of. So the big step in this is really thinking about your land in its vulnerabilities. And I break these up into 3 buckets. So the first are things that might affect the future forest. So this is regeneration. The second bucket are conditions of your overstory trees that might mean they're less resilient to disturbances. And the third is really about ecosystem processes. So these are conditions of the forest that affect the soils and the water quality. So that first bucket, the tree regeneration, these are things like invasive plants, especially really large populations, because they can outcompete regeneration of seedlings and success of those seedlings to become saplings and become trees. Certainly things like animal browse, deer browse is a big issue for seedlings and saplings in our state. We are realizing now we have an incredible bottleneck in our regeneration class in our forests, mainly because of deer browse pressure. So this can alter the species composition because they like certain species over others, or they can just decimate sort of the entire regenerating class. So if you see only a few tree seedlings in the understory, or maybe only a few species, that's sort of a red flag that maybe some interventions are needed. And looking at the overstory trees, so I sort of talked about this with the old field white pine, but things like any unhealthy looking trees, but insect or disease damage, but trees that are very close together and have small crowns. So you can see in these 2 photos, those are examples of old plantations, which we have commonly through our state. When our state was mostly unforested, people went in and planted trees, often very close together. And so they're all of a similar size, similar age, and similar species. And then another thing to really be mindful of, and this is a common occurrence in Vermont, it's nothing to be, it's something that is really ubiquitous, is old roads that happened maybe decades ago when folks didn't know that they shouldn't drive tractors straight up a hill, in the woods. And I see this all over the state on public and private land, old skid roads, old access roads. And so oftentimes these weren't closed out with appropriate drainage that allows the water to get off the surface. And so we see things like this, which basically these roads become stream beds. And so there's a soil erosion and rutting, areas of soil that are not covered in leaf litter, or failing drainages like this culvert. And then another thing, as I mentioned, lack of deadwood. And we want to see that in the forest. That's just something that we know is good for nutrient processing, cycling, stops erosion. It can hold leaf litter and so twigs and things like that, and good for a huge suite of wildlife rely on deadwood. And so I have a number of strategies that, depending on those vulnerabilities, you can use. And so the first is thinking about slow spread and sinking water. So instead of what we used to do, decades ago, which was channelize water and get it off a site as fast as possible, we know that causes erosion and water quality issues. The best thing is to keep that water in your forest, but ensuring any infrastructure you have can withstand extreme events, and minimizing that channeling of water and trying to get that water into places where it can slowly be absorbed, and keeping it in the woods. Like I mentioned, you can use deadwood to do this, which is a kind of cool free technique and provides a lot of other services. One thing I suggest is that you can walk in your woods during a heavy rainfall event or right after, and you'll quickly see where the water is flowing. And along those lines is just doing what you can to protect soils and water quality. So really important, any active timber harvest, but also if you drive ATVs in your woods, if you have hiking trails, if you have a sugar bush, thinking about reducing impacts. So avoiding wet, mucky areas, selecting equipment with the smallest impact. Anytime the ground is frozen or dry is much better. We know that wet soils compact much more rapidly than dry or frozen soils. As I mentioned, fixing or closing out old roads is really important. And there are a lot of techniques loggers are using, and foresters are recommending loggers use to reduce those impacts. So using bridges and even branches you can put down on the traveled surface to reduce compaction. And of course, things like maintaining plants. Anytime you have a water source, so maintaining plants along those stream banks, ponds, lakes, wetlands is really important. As I mentioned, we have a regeneration issue, debt. It's what we call it, regeneration debt in our state. So focusing on regeneration, and this does involve gaps in the canopy. So those trees need space, they need light to grow. And so we do often have to emulate natural disturbances. So this would occur naturally when trees die or when there's a disturbance, and that would leave space for these new young trees. And sometimes we have to help the forest have this happen more frequently. We can do that through timber management. And of course, retaining large, healthy trees. They can be a source of seed and pollen. And sometimes we have to go in and do some thinning even to help trees survive. And this can be particularly important if you have other competing plants, like unfortunately American beech sprouts very readily and can outcompete other trees. In places that you have high deer pressure, that might be a really critical bottleneck to think about ways to control that browse. The best way really is through hunting. There are some other ways, fencing and things like that, but they're really costly. We do know that hunting it has been shown as a great way to control the deer browse pressure. And certainly you can use tree planting, although relying on natural regeneration is really sort of the easiest and best and cheapest thing you can do. I mentioned complexity. We can do this on two levels: species diversity. So keeping those less common species, keeping the diversity you have on site, maybe those ones that do well in the future, are tolerant of changing conditions, but also this idea of structural complexity. And that can happen vertically and also horizontally. So we just want that non-uniformity in our forests, so gaps in the canopy, tree ages, sizes, all this sort of stuff is really great for a forest and for the development. And of course, retaining standing dead trees is a good one for that complexity. And that brings me to the next step 8, which is just increasing deadwood. And like I said, you don't have to do all of these at once. They might not, choose the ones that fit best for you, you're most excited about, also that relate to your vulnerabilities. So this is one that's sort of fun to do, although, it does create messier woods, but it's easy to do. You can do it on your own. You can girdle trees, you can fell trees, leaving logs and dead trees where they are, but you can fell trees and leave them in place. If you have an operator on site, they can actually push over trees with equipment to create a tip up. So that's when the root ball is up in the air, and that's great for a lot of wildlife. There's some species that require that. We can also what we call girdle, which is taking a chainsaw and cutting a concentric circle around a tree. I've done this on my property, and the trees slowly die and create this great area where you have a gap, basically, but you have, and so you get regeneration, but you have standing dead trees that can provide a number of benefits. And certainly old trees are great to live out, and they can be what we call future deadwood. Managing other stressors sort of goes along with all of this. Anytime you promote healthy, vigorous trees on in your woodlot, in your forest, you're going to reduce the impact of stressors, but certainly controlling as best you can. If you can eradicate, great, but controlling invasive plants so they don't inhibit regeneration. I mentioned animal browse. That's a hard one, but even monitoring for that is really important. And certainly anytime we have a species, a diversity of ages and species, we also have bigger ability in our forest to withstand stressors. One thing that folks are often interested in is this idea of future adapted species. And I sort of talked about this earlier, the southern and northern species, cold loving and warm loving species. So this is the list of species here for what we have projections for. So in red is this suitable habitat is projected to decline. Again, we're not going to lose these species, but they'll be more stressed. I did put a little asterisk by sugar maple because it has such a big distribution and a big genetic diversity in the species that we think, even though this is a cold loving species, we actually think the species is very adaptable. It can grow in lots of different places. And so we're less worried about this species than we are like balsam fir, which has a much more limited range. Yellow is suitable habitat will be the same. And then green, which is the longest list, I will note, is the species that we think are going to expand. And I will note that this does not include impacts of insects or diseases. It's just about the climate in the future. So you'll see some species on here that have notable insect pressures or disease pressures. So, thinking about if you have these already on site, some of these future climate adapted species, keeping them. My woods are starting to have red oak regenerate in the understory. I make sure to keep those, maybe even making an opening around those oaks so that they have space and light to grow. Certainly species that, depending on your site, you might want to favor species that handle drier conditions like oaks and pines, or that tolerate disturbances. Another critical thing is thinking about protecting anything unique, anything else. It might not even be unique statewide, just unique on your property or special place. And that's really critical. Like I mentioned, we're in a biodiversity crisis. So uncommon plants, plant communities, special places, wildlife features like this middle photo of a snag with cavity holes, right? Any water sources, really important to protect. And I will say, there is an importance of thinking about your forest in the future. So thinking about long-term plans for your parcel, made sure, ensuring that it remains forest. So thinking about, have you thought up legacy planning? And there's folks in our state like VHCB that can work with you on that, on thinking about your land. And the last step is monitoring and planning for the unexpected, as I mentioned. So this can be, this doesn't have to be like a spreadsheet really detailed, but having a notebook where oh, there was a frost event in May and these species were damaged, or, I had forest tent caterpillar outbreak this year. And keeping track of those things can be really important, especially thinking about management outcomes. If you do active management, what does the site look like after a year or 5 years, right? There's really, we've sometimes it's hard for us to see that forests are changing, but they do really change over time and develop. There are a lot of technical resources in our state. I am one of them, but not the only one. And so take advantage of things that we have, resources, ask questions. There's lots of folks that are willing to help you. And along that line, here is my website. So you can go here and I will send this along. I have a number of resources. I'm sort of growing resources on here. There's climate change resources, there's carbon resources, there's more general forest ecology resources that range from really introductory to a little bit more technical. And this is the resource I was mentioning, the Managing Your Forest with Climate Change in Mind, and the little cards with the longer document that's available as a PDF as well. And again, there's the website and my contact email, and I'm always happy to hear from landowners and folks. So yeah, don't hesitate to reach out, and I will take some questions if there are any. And I guess I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Ali. And please, to the people watching, don't worry if you missed the links or Ali's email. I can send that in a follow-up email if you just send it to me, Ali. That'd be great.
Yes, I will do that.
Can get it. Thank you. That was such a diverse presentation and covered so many different facets of the topic. I want to encourage people watching or who didn't hear and join late to put questions in the chat here on Zoom. We have some here already, and we can start with those if that sounds good.
Yeah.
I can do the first one, Michael. How do warmer temperatures and higher rainfall impact soil pH? What is the dynamic between the impacts of climate change and acid rain?
I'm gonna think of that one. So, well, I can talk about acid. I'll talk about acid rain first. So acid rain actually is a good story, and I think it's helpful when we get really paralyzed thinking, or sort of scared thinking about climate change. I worked a lot with acid rain and the effects on our species here in Vermont, and it is one of those stories that it took some time, but scientists noticed that there's impacts of acid rain. And in fact, that some of those impacts, when they first were noted, acid rain was first discovered in our country in New Hampshire at Hubbard Brook, but some of the first impacts on forests were noted here at Camel's Hump. So there's this great paper called Catastrophe at Camel's Hump, and there was researchers here at UVM, Hub Vogelman notably, but other folks that really, they testified to Congress that they collected data and showed that there were impacts to trees, and there were changes made. So we had the Clean Air Act, we had amendments to the Clear Act, and some of my research when I was a PhD student at UVM, I showed that there was actually recovery. It took a long time, right? It took decades, actually. We see a recovery in our trees, our sensitive trees, sugar maple and red spruce in particular, and we are seeing recovery. The acidity of rain has gotten lower. So the rain has gotten less acidic, and it's almost to the point where we think it was pre-industrial time. So that's great. So we're really not worried about acid rain. It's still taking a while for our soils to recover and our water bodies to recover, but we're on track. So I don't think there will be much impact between climate change and acid rain just because acid rain is less of a problem. I have to think about how warmer temperatures and higher rainfall impact soil pH. It's a really good question, and one I don't know if I know the answer to that. Most of our soils, our forest soils here in Vermont are on the acidic side. That's just totally normal. They're not like agricultural soils. So they're in the pH of 4, very normal, pH of 5, very normal. But yeah, I'm not sure if I know. I'll look into that. I'll follow up if I can find anything. I don't know if anybody's looked into that interaction. There are a lot of interactions from climate change that it might not be that anybody's researched it. So it's a great question.
Thank you. I just want to second what Ginevra said. What a really comprehensive talk. You always touch on some of everything. Really appreciate that.
Good.
This question is, I'm from northern New Jersey. Can these recommendations to help save forests apply to different states?
Yes, I think so. And welcome. I didn't realize there would be someone from New Jersey, so glad you could make it. Yes, these are pretty universal. I mean, some of the stuff I said, Vermont County foresters, I don't know exactly what your forester situation is in New Jersey, but reach out to, your state forest office, or if you have an extension service in your state. But yeah, these are pretty universal. We have very similar forest conditions across the eastern seaboard, in that we had, widespread land clearing and sort of young forests, and then forests that have been affected by poor management decisions. And so we can do, all these principles are pretty universal: increasing species diversity, increasing complexity. Downwood might be one, depending in New Jersey does have fire mediated systems. So you have New Jersey pine barrens. So that's the one thing about increasing deadwood. We don't really have really dominant fire systems in our state. And so I'm not really worried about increasing deadwood in that fuel loading, but, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that same strategy for, out west where there are a lot of fires. There's sort of a different need there. They're often doing things like thinning the density of the stand to reduce catastrophic fires. So depending on what type of forest you have in New Jersey, but the other ones, reducing, stressors, monitoring, promoting regeneration, all of those are really universal to all forests. We know that we know that they exist in old growth stands. And so that's how we know that they're signs of good ecosystem functioning. And we know there were conditions that existed, before we did widespread land clearing and sort of maladaptive management.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ali. We have another question here that I thought might come up. Should I do something as the ash trees die on my property? Let them stand, create gaps, favor the saplings?
Yep. So I had it on the last slide and it's on my website, but we do have a couple recommendations for managing ash. So I worked on with a couple folks. We have these it's called 10 steps. I know, I love the 10, 12 steps. It's called 10 steps for managing ash under emerald ash borer and climate change. And we actually did two versions. One's a little bit geared towards a forester audience, so it uses some language that foresters use. And then one we geared a little bit more to a landowner, and they're labeled thus. I think I have both of them on my site, and I'll send them along. But as far as thinking about, so that's sort of like 1-2 punch with ash. And so we can have interactions with emerald ash borer and ash. Ash is one of the species we actually think will do well in a changing climate if it wasn't for EAB. And so promoting regeneration is one thing we think is really important. Ash needs pretty big gaps, at least a 1/4 acre. It's a species, so different tree species have different regeneration requirements, and we usually define these about how much light they need when they can establish. So something like sugar maple, eastern hemlock, they can establish in dense understory. So we call them shade tolerant species. But then we have other species that are shade intolerant. So they have to regenerate and grow in full open sun. Ash is kind of in the middle, but it does need much more sun than a species like sugar maple. And so we know that for successful regeneration, or else it just sort of withers away and doesn't persist, it needs at least 1/4 acre gaps. And so you can make those, and maybe those will occur naturally from mortality, but you could accelerate that. One thing that's really critical with ash, there are male and female ash trees. So some trees have both male and female parts. Some are, either male or female, and ash is one of those. And we know that there are many more male trees than female trees. So it's about like 7-to-1 or 9-to-1 males to females. And so one thing that you can do if you see that there's ash seed on a tree, and so it comes sort of later in the summer. Actually, last summer was a very big ash seed year. And so I was recommending landowners and foresters go out, take flagging tape and put it around the stem of those trees so that you remember, because it's really hard. You can't tell the difference any other time of year. It's very hard. In the spring, you can kind of tell with flowering, but it's really hard. It's easiest when they have the seed in the fall. And so preserving those female trees is really important. So what you could do, and this is one of the recommendations, is flagging those and creating gaps near that female tree. So you have an opening, allows that regeneration to happen. And I will say the state has released a number of parasitoids that affect the emerald ash borer larvae and or the adult, different stages. I think they've released 3 different species. And so our hope is that, as that parasitoid increases in population, it will sort of control the emerald ash borer. We're never going to get rid of emerald ash borer. So thinking about ways you could have younger trees that are less susceptible to EAB is really great. So favoring that regeneration and preserving those female trees, because you don't need as many males to female, so you could remove some of the male trees.
I'm glad you mentioned about the ratio of male to female ash trees, because I'm always looking at the big male flowers and always trying to find the female ash trees. And I'm always wondering, why are they so hard to find? I didn't realize that was the case.
Yeah. Yep. So yeah, so keep an eye out for that. And they won't necessarily have a lot of seed every year. And so it really depends. Yeah, last year was a huge ash seed year. And so keeping an eye out in the fall. And sometimes they'll set a persist after the leaves drop too. And so that can be a good time to find them too.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank
Well,
you.
yeah, I'll send that link around because there's some other things we included in as some considerations about thinking about ash.
That would be great. I don't think we have any more questions here.
Hi, Tim.
All right. Well, if there's nothing else that you've got in your mind, you've really given us a lot of information. So
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sure everyone's like, and so that's why, yeah, go to I'll send the links along. And so a lot of what you can reference back to that if you've forgotten things or whatever, and look back and walk through your woods and sort of think about some of these aspects in that new context. And so yeah, I'll share those resources.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Cool. All right. Well, everyone have a lovely evening.
You too.
Okay, take care.
Thanks everybody for joining us.